Hey everyone, welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about something that I think is pretty relevant to almost everybody listening,
Yeah.
and that is microaggressions.
Hmm.
And we're going to be taking a look at a really fascinating article that was published actually just this month on February 2nd by Allison Rowe called Unseen Impacts: How Microaggressions Shape Our Everyday Lives. Have you had a chance to look at this one?
Yeah, I have, and
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting.
It is really interesting.
I think, as you were saying, it's something that everybody kind of can relate to in some way.
Absolutely.
Whether you've been on the receiving end, or maybe you've even been the person
Right.
who's said something that's been interpreted as a microaggression.
Yeah, and it's all these little things that, we don't really always think about or, maybe aren't even aware of.
Hmm.
So I thought this would be a really fascinating one to take a deep dive into.
Yeah, I think so.
So I guess to kick things off, what are microaggressions? How does Rowe define them?
Well, so she defines them as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative prejudicial slights and insults toward any group, particularly culturally marginalized groups.
Okay, wow. So it's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Um, so these are things that are happening, on a daily basis, and, they can be intentional. They can be unintentional,
Right.
which is part of what I think makes them so tricky.
Absolutely.
Can you give me an example maybe that Rowe uses in her article?
Yeah, she gives a really good example of a microaggression that happens quite often, and it's something along the lines of someone saying to a person of color, "Wow, your English is so good."
Yeah,
And, on the surface, that may sound like a compliment, but when you really think about it, what's the implication there?
right.
What is that really saying?
Yeah, like you wouldn't expect me to speak English well,
Right.
which is, kind of an insult.
Yeah, you're surprised by that. And that's kind of, getting to the heart of what a microaggression is.
Yeah, like why are you surprised that I speak English well? Like,
Hmm.
what are you trying to say?
Right.
Um, so Rowe categorizes these microaggressions into three different types.
Yes.
I'd like to go through those.
Okay.
So can you tell me a little bit about each of those three types?
Sure. So she talks about micro assaults,
Okay.
micro insults, and micro invalidations.
Okay, so let's start with the micro assaults.
Sure. So micro assaults are really the kinds of microaggressions that are most similar to what we would consider overt discrimination.
Okay.
So, using racial epithets or, things that are very explicitly
Right.
prejudiced against somebody.
Okay, got it.
Then we have micro insults, and those are often delivered as compliments.
Oh, interesting.
So they're these kind of backhanded compliments.
Oh, like a sneaky dig?
Right, right. Like, I love how assertive you are, for a woman, or,
Yeah.
wow, you're so articulate,
Right, right.
to someone who's a person of color.
Yeah.
And then we have micro-invalidations. And these are really the kinds of microaggressions that exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color.
Okay, so can you give me an example of one of those?
Yeah, for example, someone
Yeah.
saying, "I don't see color," or,
Oh, yeah.
"I was taught to treat everybody the same,"
Right, right.
that sort of thing.
So they're denying your experience essentially.
Right, exactly. And they're saying that, your lived reality isn't real
Got it.
or valid or,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow, so these are really fascinating, and I mean to think that this is happening, on a daily basis for,
Yeah.
People who are part of marginalized groups. I mean,
Hmm.
I imagine it takes a toll.
It does. And, Rowe gets into this concept of racial battle fatigue.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but can you explain a little bit more about what that means?
So racial battle fatigue
Mhm.
is really this, being constantly on guard
Okay.
for these kinds of microaggression. It's kind of been this exhausting experience, and
Yeah.
it's been shown to actually have
Ugh.
some really detrimental.
Like actual physical effects.
Yeah. So there's, emotional and psychological effects,
Okay.
yeah, it contributes to anxiety,
Mhm.
depression, all sorts of things. But then there's also physical manifestations
Yeah.
like high blood pressure, increased risk of stroke, heart disease,
Wow.
all kinds of things.
I mean, I can't even imagine, just being on guard all the time.
Yeah.
And knowing that at any moment, somebody could say something
Right.
that is, hurtful in this way.
Absolutely.
And, a lot of times you might not even feel comfortable saying something about it.
Right.
It's just like, I'm going to let that one go.
Yeah,
But it's all adding up.
it is.
So that's really fascinating. And also, I think it would be interesting to talk about how this impacts somebody's sense of self.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
if you are constantly, having these experiences like you don't belong here, you're different, you're other, how does that shape how you see yourself?
Right. Well, and Rowe talks about this idea of internalized oppression,
Okay.
where you start to internalize these messages.
So you start to believe it.
You start to believe it, and, you start to question your own
Right.
validity, and your own belonging.
Yeah, like, do I deserve to be here?
Right.
Do
I
I?
have a right to be here,
Yeah.
you know.
Wow. So that's a really powerful
Yeah.
concept. And to think that, that all stems from these seemingly, small interactions that are happening on a daily basis.
Right.
It's pretty incredible. So where do we see these microaggressions play out most often?
Well, Rowe really talks about the workplace and social settings as being,
Okay.
primary places where this happens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in the workplace,
Oh, yeah.
there are so many opportunities
Constantly. Yeah.
for microaggressions.
Yeah. Can you give me an example from the workplace?
Yeah. So one example might be, having your ideas dismissed in a meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And then, somebody else kind of repackages the idea
Yeah.
and presents it. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant.
Oh, that's the best idea we've ever heard.
Right. Or being constantly interrupted.
Yeah.
Or talked over.
Or, being told, oh, wow, you're so articulate.
Right.
Like it's
As if they're surprised.
the surprise. Yeah. And then what about social settings?
Yeah. So in social settings, think about those questions like, where are you really from?
Oh, yeah.
Or having to constantly explain
Right.
your culture or your traditions or,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
all of that.
Yeah. I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
I'm really starting to think about all these things and, whether I've
Good,
maybe
bad,
been
whatever.
guilty of this too, because
Right.
it's something that, we all need to be more aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, one of the most important things that White highlights
Yeah.
in this article. But, before we go on, I think it'd be interesting to also talk about how the media plays a role in this whole
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
thing, and how it kind of perpetuates these stereotypes and these ideas.
Absolutely. And we're going to get into that when we come back.
Stay tuned. Welcome back. So we were talking about how the media shapes our perception of people and can contribute to those microaggressions.
Right.
But let's get a little bit more practical now
Yeah.
and talk about what we can do when we see those happening in real life.
Okay.
So if we are in a situation and we see a microaggression happening,
Mm-hmm.
what can we actually do about it?
So, as Rowe talks about in her article, there are a number of different ways
Okay.
to go about this. One way is to directly address it.
Okay.
So, let's say you hear a colleague make a comment about someone's accent.
Right.
You could say something like, hey, that comment felt a little disrespectful. Could you clarify what you meant?
Okay. So giving them the benefit of the doubt,
Right.
but also, signaling that that was not okay.
Right.
But what about when it's not a colleague? What if it's a friend or a family member?
Right.
Those can be a little trickier.
Yeah, those are always a little trickier. In those situations, I think sometimes it can be helpful to kind of appeal to their values.
Okay.
So you might say something like, I know you really value fairness, and that comment,
Yeah.
didn't really align with that for me.
Yeah.
It's important to me that we, treat everybody with respect, regardless of, their background.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah. So it's like framing it in a way where they can see it from that
Oh,
perspective.
Exactly.
So I guess in those situations too, it's more about like starting a conversation.
Yeah, it's not about like winning an argument or
Right.
proving them wrong.
Yeah, it's about helping them to see it from a different perspective.
Oh.
Right. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is just to be there for the person
Mhm.
who's been targeted by the microaggression.
Absolutely.
Just to check in with them
Right.
and say, hey, I saw that happen and I'm here for you if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, and really, sometimes the best thing to do is just listen,
Yeah.
and not try to fix it or tell them how they should feel.
Right.
Just really, listen and be present.
Yeah. And I think that that can be incredibly validating
Absolutely.
for the person who's experiencing that. So, we've talked about those direct approaches,
Mm-hmm.
but Rowe also talks about this idea of bystander intervention,
Yes.
which I think is really fascinating. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
So bystander intervention is really this idea of, recognizing that we all have a responsibility
Okay.
to interrupt these behaviors,
Right.
even if we're not the target.
Got it.
So you know that silence
Yeah.
can often be interpreted as agreement
Right.
or
Yeah.
acceptance.
Yeah, so it's like if you're not saying anything, you're basically saying, yeah, I agree with that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So you're sending the message that this is okay.
Okay, so it's almost like we have a responsibility then to speak up
We do.
when we see something happening.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of people get kind of,
Yeah.
stuck, or they're not sure what to do.
Right, like how do you do that?
Yeah, how do you actually go about doing that without, making the situation worse?
Yeah. Or putting yourself in a bad spot.
Right, and it really, the approach that you take depends on the context.
Okay.
Sometimes a simple, hey, that's not cool,
Right.
might be enough.
Right. Right.
Or calling them out.
Right.
Right.
Saying
Specifically did.
that comment perpetuates a harmful stereotype.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that not all, whatever group it is,
Right.
are like
Right.
that.
Right.
Something along those lines. So you're calling it out, but you're also educating at the same time.
Right.
Which I think is a really good approach.
Yeah, it kind of, turns it into a learning opportunity,
Yeah.
potentially.
Okay, so, but what happens when, you say something and the person gets defensive or they're like,
That happens.
yeah,
And I think in those situations, it's really important to prioritize your own safety
okay,
and well-being.
got it.
Sometimes the best thing to do is to just remove yourself from the situation.
Okay.
You can't force someone to change their views,
Right.
but you can make it clear that,
That you're not okay with that
Right.
behavior.
Yeah.
And then also, we were talking about how the media kind of reinforces these stereotypes and stuff. So it's like, we need to be more mindful of the media we're consuming.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about like the movies you watch or the shows you stream. Are they representing, diverse perspectives? Are they challenging stereotypes or are they reinforcing stereotypes?
Yeah, that makes you think.
Yeah.
So that's a really good point. And then also, thinking about the workplace again. Like, what can organizations actually do
Right.
to create more inclusive environments?
Yeah. So I think, it goes beyond just having a diversity statement on your website.
Right.
It's really about having, comprehensive diversity inclusion training
Okay.
for all employees.
Got it.
And, not just like a one-time thing, but something that's ongoing.
Yeah.
And really, helps people to understand
Right.
the nuances of these issues.
So it's like giving people the tools to recognize these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, creating a culture where people feel
Yeah.
safe to speak up.
Absolutely.
If they do experience something.
Right. Having clear reporting mechanisms.
Yeah.
And, holding people accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
All of that is really important.
Yeah. And then also, thinking about representation at all levels of the organization, from entry level all the way up to
Absolutely.
leadership roles.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial.
Yeah.
Making sure that diverse voices are heard and that decisions are made with a variety of perspectives in mind.
There really is like a cultural shift that needs to happen.
Yeah.
I think across the board.
Absolutely.
In workplaces and schools and communities and our personal lives.
Yeah, it's about consciously creating a culture
Right.
of empathy and understanding.
Yeah. So we've talked about all these different things that we can do. But before we wrap up, I also want to touch on one more thing that Ro discusses, and that is the power of language.
Sure. That's a good one.
And we're going to get into that when we come back. Welcome back to the show. So before the break, we were talking about how important it is for organizations to really, commit to creating these inclusive environments.
Yeah.
But I want to circle back to something that we touched on a little bit earlier, and that's the power of language.
Yeah.
Ro really dives into this in her article.
She does.
And I thought it was so fascinating because, we don't always think about the ways in which
Right.
our language can actually perpetuate these biases.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Language is so powerful. It really shapes how we see the world and how we interact with each other. And even those seemingly small, harmless phrases can reinforce stereotypes.
Right.
And contribute to this culture of microaggressions.
It's like these biases are baked into our everyday language without us even realizing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So, one example is the phrase, you guys.
Oh, yeah.
It's often used as a gender-neutral term.
Right.
But it still centers men as the default.
That's so interesting. I've never even thought about that.
Yeah.
But you're right.
And, And there are other examples. You know, think about the language we use when
Yes,
talking
yeah.
about race or ethnicity or ability or,
Mm.
really any aspect of identity.
Hmm.
Terms like ghetto or exotic. Those carry these negative connotations and can really reinforce harmful stereotypes.
Right.
And even, praising someone for being articulate or well-spoken,
Yeah.
that can imply this surprise based on their race or ethnicity.
Oh, yeah.
So it's
Oh,
really being mindful of the words that we use
great.
and the messages that they convey, even unintentionally.
It's like being more intentional with your language.
Exactly. And, challenging ourselves to use language that really reflects the diversity
Mm-hmm.
of human experience.
Yeah. So it's an ongoing process, I think,
It is.
for all of us to kind of check ourselves and
Right.
think about the words we're using.
Absolutely. And, being open to, adjusting our language as we learn and grow.
Yeah, it's not about being afraid to speak or,
Right.
being, politically correct. It's really about, fostering this sense of
Yeah.
respect.
Respect and inclusivity,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. And, it's really made me think about these things in a whole new light.
Yeah.
I hope everybody listening
Me too.
has, taken away some things that they can apply
Right.
in their own lives.
Absolutely.
Because, I think that that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's about, raising awareness and then
Mhm.
taking action.
Yes.
And, even if it's just those small steps,
Yeah.
every little bit counts.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into microaggressions.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.